and perhaps let me be honest and disruptive and frank here, it's also about not entirely screwing up our planet as we grow. It's about tackling climate change, it's about making production and consumption patterns much more sustainable. At its core, really, the new agenda is about structural transformations in countries at all income levels to ensure that the planet's natural limits are respected. Nations, peoples, and prospects have always been intertwined, but I think it's fair to say that the challenge for the Caribbean region is that the region's capacities to make progress on this new agenda will also be shaped by the actions, or perhaps the inaction, of other states, of factors basically beyond their control. And I say that not to absolve the region's leadership of any responsibility to exercise leadership more effectively. I just say it as a statement of fact. So where is the rest of the discussion on financing for development? I mean, I think one of the difficulties we face is that there are few, if any, promises of additional public resources on the table. The commitment to increase international development aid and climate finance remain fragile, even though they will be critically important in supporting the new agenda. There is a lot of focus on increasing domestic public resources for financing development, and that's with good reason, of course, because domestic financial resources are the most important source of financing for development. But of course, many governments don't want to be straitjacketed with targets for increasing domestic public financing for development. And of course, as UNDP, the Commonwealth Secretariat, and many others have pointed out, countries have structural constraints and extremely differentiated capacities to mobilize domestic resources for development. There is a lot of enthusiasm, bordering on hysteria, perhaps, I would say, on the role of the private sector in financing sustainable development. And I think there's a lot of enthusiasm, okay, well, the private sector holds so many resources, they can play so much more of an active role in financing sustainable development. I think our fundamental point here is that the private sector responds to incentives. So if we want to reorient more private finance towards sustainable development ends, we have to enact regulatory changes in order to provide an incentive structure which reorients private finance towards sustainable development. And finally, money matters, yes, of course it matters, but it's necessary and perhaps not sufficient at the same time. And there's a lot of discussion at the moment in the UN on the role of more cash versus the roles of the enabling environment. For instance, the role of more cash versus the role of things like better institutions. Okay, so that's perhaps a broad overview of the state of the debate in New York on financing for development at the moment. What's in it for the Caribbean? And I've perhaps tried to point out here the good, the bad, and the ugly, where that stands. Perhaps I should have used those faces there from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, that great film. Okay, so let me speak about the good first. I mean, I think so far there is a recognition among countries that vulnerability is important. Vulnerability deserves special attention, and that shocks are inevitable and regular part of countries' realities, and that countries that exhibit particular vulnerabilities deserve special attention and treatment. I think there's also a recognition that we need to revisit the criteria for eligibility for aid, that criteria beyond income per capita are important when we think about who should receive aid. It's not just about, if you're wealthier, you can stand on your own 2 feet. It's about more than that. There's a recognition that we need increased transparency in official finance, and we need to improve the effectiveness, the quality of those resources as well. There's a focus on sustainable infrastructure development, which I think is positive and will be crucial to take us towards the new global development agenda. There are proposals, for example, for a global infrastructure facility, which are extremely positive. There is a focus on the importance of social protection, which is good, and also a recognition that more needs to be done to cooperate on international tax so that governments are enabled to collect the tax revenues, which will enable them to raise domestic resources and fund development. What about the bad? What are some of the risks for the Caribbean region from this process? The first I've put, and one that's quite critical, I think, is that there is a major focus on domestic resource mobilization as the principal means to finance this new agenda. And the reason I raise this as a challenge for the region is that some research we've carried out, and others have carried out similar sorts of studies, show that different countries have extremely differentiated capacities to mobilize domestic resources for development. As this chart shows, many Caribbean countries and other small islands experience severe structural constraints in their capacities to mobilize both domestic and external financing for development. Many have found, as you can see in the bottom left-hand quadrant, which means they have low capacities to mobilize domestic and external financing for development, despite often higher income per capita levels. So we've tried to point to that more actively. There's not enough attention, in my view, to the debt challenges faced by some small island developing states. We've heard a lot about that this is an issue in particular for the Caribbean. I think there could be stronger commitments that the debt challenges of this region require urgent and special attention, and we'll be pushing for that. The discussions around climate finance and aid remain difficult, with limited willingness to actually put more resources on the table. There's little interest in furthering some of the discussions on innovative financing for development, despite some of the enthusiasm that has been shown for initiatives in the past. Some are concerned by the interest in furthering public-private partnerships. Some are concerned about the track record that public-private partnerships have had in the past and question whether they're suitable arrangements, in particular for some low-income countries. And then finally, and Amina mentioned this morning, the crucial issue of how will governments be held to account for the promises they're made? Will there be some sort of robust mechanism to hold them to account for their commitments? So what about us? What about UNDP? Given all of this, what are we doing to be disruptive to this process? At UNDP, we're very committed to the Caribbean region and to all SIDS. Working with partners such as the Commonwealth Secretariat and others, we're doing all we can to ensure that the Caribbean region and all SIDS are able to secure as much from this process as possible, despite the constraints that we've identified. So, for instance, it's incredible but true, but there was not even any mention in this process before about vulnerability, risk, volatility, and the importance of resilience. And so we've been really trying to push that as something really important for consideration. We've been trying really hard to focus on the structural constraints to domestic resource mobilizations that not all countries, and especially SIDS, will be able to meet the huge demands of the new agenda from domestic finance alone. We're pushing for the eligibility criteria for access to development aid and concessional finance to be reformed, which, if successful, and we hope it will be, will have major implications on improving access to that finance for this region. On climate finance, we're trying to ensure that the architecture for those funds is simplified, that there is a better balance between adaptation and mitigation resources, and that countries that are most vulnerable to climate change are able to get the resources that they need, because this region and SIDS as a whole have not been major beneficiaries of climate finance so far. So working to secure improvements there. We're working to strengthen the language on debt as part of this process, perhaps calling for a new debt relief framework, debt for climate swaps, multi-creditor debt swaps, to all be part of the conversation on how we resolve debt sustainability challenges. We're also thinking and doing some work around piloting new financial innovation. So we'll release a paper in Addis Ababa, for instance, making the case for GDP index bonds on official credits and what kind of contribution these kinds of innovations can make in maintaining debt sustainability, supporting the efforts of the Commonwealth Secretariat, for instance, and others on counter-cyclical loans as another mechanism by which countries can build resilience. We're conducting advocacy with donors and lenders, new and old alike, to try to raise awareness of SIDS financing for development challenges, ensure they're integrated into their programs and their thinking. And then, of course, finally, our country-level work is extremely important to UNDP, trying to build capacity at the country level to actually access, leverage, and manage new sources of finance, especially climate finance. So, what are my final thoughts? Because I've already been given the red card. A few. First, often public and private investors will say, oh, you know, we want to come in. We have resources to invest, for instance, in new sustainable infrastructure and so on. But what is the problem is that we don't have enough bankable projects. The feasibility studies have not been carried out. There's not enough bankable projects. And it's those countries that have the capacities to develop strong project ideas that will see the cash in the future. And so I think that will be a major source of convergence or divergence in the future, that capacity building matters. It's not just a case of expanding innovative financing solutions. Capacity building to develop bankable projects will be just as important, if not more, than innovative financing solutions. Second, you know, much of the expansion in financial flows that we're likely to see over the SDG period, and we'll see a major expansion in finance continue over the next period, will be financed by new debt. And so we must not sow the seeds of future debt crisis. That's something else we've been trying to insist on as part of this process, especially for states with already fragile debt situations. And ending on a positive note, I think that, you know, the scale of the challenges that we have ahead of us are huge, that much is clear. But we also have more resources and capabilities, human, technical, financial, and otherwise, and at any other time in human history to actually tackle them. And so I think, you know, it's clearly therefore a question of political will. And in democratic societies, political will is often shaped by all of us. It's shaped by you guys here. So this is my appeal to you in ending, that, you know, progress towards the SDGs, it really depends on all of us. And let's hold our governments to account for the promises they make on financing for development and on the SDGs. So many thanks for your time this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hurley, for your presentation and very important considerations about this issue on financing for development. I would like now to introduce to you the next panelist, Mr. Joala Rambaran, Governor of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. Governor Rambaran will make his presentation on the topic New and Innovative Sources of Financing, the role of the diaspora bonds and blue bonds. Governor, please, I give you the floor now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair. And first, let me express my thanks